Welcome to the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies Online. For more information about our programs, publications and membership, please visit our website, themuslimfaculty.org.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the History of the Muslims program of the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies. This is the fourth of 12 sessions which make up the History of the Khalifas module. The lecture will last approximately 40 minutes, during which time you should make a written note of any questions that may occur to you for clarification after the lecture. And the following lecture is based on lecture notes that Haja Aisha Bewley prepared, but since she's not able to deliver them, I have reworked her notes slightly and will present that for you today. In the previous lecture, we concluded with the Khilafah of Al-Hasan ibn Ali that lasted for 6 months before he agreed on transferring the leadership to Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, and thereby realizing the words of the Prophet ﷺ, who said about Al-Hasan, "This son of mine is a master. Perhaps Allah will make peace between two great parties of the Muslims through him." And it was in the year 41 after Hijrah, later known as Am al-Jama'ah, the year of community, that Muawiyah entered Kufa and was given bay'ah as Khalifa in the presence of both Al-Hasan and Al-Hussein. Then Al-Hasan retired to Medina, and the capital of the Khilafah was relocated to the ancient world city of Damascus. And it's from this new center in the heart of Bilad Asham that this lecture will continue the history of the Khalifas. And we begin with Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, who was the Khalifa from year 40 to year 60 after Hijrah. And when Muawiyah became Khalifa, he had many years of political experience from his time as governor in Syria. As Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi concludes, there were many Sahaba who were more entitled to leadership than him. But Muawiyah had certain qualities that made him fit for leadership over the Muslims, as indicated by the fact that Omar ibn al-Khattab had united all of Syria under him and singled him out for that, when he saw his good conduct, his undertaking to guard the heart and barricading the ports, putting the army in order, attacking the enemy, and managing the people. The new center in Damascus meant that the Khilafah was not only tied to one of the geopolitically most important regions, but also to the most organized and loyal army of the time, which Muawiyah had built up during his time as Amir of Syria. The Muslims hoped that the Ummah united under Muawiyah. The Muslims hoped that with the Ummah united under Muawiyah, there would be an end to the fitna that had continued unabated since the murder of Uthman. There was, however, intense debate whether the person with the best qualities and virtues should be Khalifa, or the one with the actual political power, Sultan. And this issue would later resurface with Al-Hussein and on many other occasions in the history of Islam. Muawiyah himself recognized other people's worth in comparison to himself, and he said in one of his khutbahs, "O people, I'm not the best of you. There are those who are better than me, include Abdullah ibn Omar and other excellent men. But it may be that I am the one who will be most useful in ruling for you, and the most harmful of you to your enemy, and the one to give you the most abundance." In short, the Umayyads held that the Khalifa was more about political power, and at the time, Muawiyah represented a power that enabled the Muslims to unite the community inwardly and uphold the strength of the Dawla outwardly. As Ibn Khaldun makes clear regarding the beginning of the Khilafah of Banu Umayya in his Kitab al-Ibar, he writes, "Banu Abd Manaf of Quraysh had bodies of numbers and ability. No one opposed them from the other clans of Quraysh. the two subdivisions of them, that is Banu Umayya and Banu Hashim, were together a tribal community, tracing their genealogy to Abd Manaf. Quraysh recognized that and asked them to assume leadership over them. However, Banu Umayya were more numerous than Banu Hashim and had more men, and power lies only in great numbers. As the poet said, power is only by great numbers. However, that is what Ibn Khaldun said. However, the recurring tendency to fragmentation after unification had been going on for some time, and Muawiyah was the one who managed to put an end to it. Ali had already noticed that this process was taking place, and during the Shura appointed to choose a Khalifa after Omar ibn al-Khattab, Ali refused to accept being Khalifa unless he was allowed some leeway in ruling which went beyond the quite limited authority of the first two Khulafa. Allegiance was given to Uthman when he agreed to the terms he was presented with. But no one had Ali's insight into the dangers inherent in the situation, which developed already during the time of Uthman. And as we will see when examining the history of the leaders after the first Khulafa Rashidun, the tendency to fragmentation always occurs, and it's only countered by either a charismatic figure or by imposition of sheer power. However, Muawiyah is an exception, because he stopped it by sheer political skill and a judicious use of power. Al-Hassan could not have done it because he did not have adequate control over the Kufans around him, where fragmentation was at its peak. He stated that this was one of the reasons for withdrawing and transferring the Khilafah to Muawiyah. And Muawiyah reconciled many of the Muslims who previously had been fighting one another through his generosity and fairness. And he also resumed the futuh which had been interrupted by the fitna. During his rule, Muawiyah had no rivals, and he also managed through fine diplomacy to balance the tribal rivalries which later destroyed Umayyad authority. He did, however, recognize the change in the form of rule, and once gave a khutbah to the people of Medina, saying, "I desired to follow by Abu Bakr and Omar, but I was unable to follow it. And so I have followed a course with you which contains fortune and benefits for you despite some bias. So be pleased with what comes to you from me, even if it's a little. When good is continuous, even if it's a little, it enriches. Discontent make life grim." Muawiyah continued to hold deputations from the provinces and the tribes, and consulted these assemblies as much as possible. He asked for their counsel, he met with them, and he accepted their criticism. In fact, an outside observer, the Greek historian Theophanus, called him a proto-symbolist, a first among equals, which is also what he called Omar ibn al-Khattab. The later fixation on Muawiyah as a king, in the sense of an absolute monarch or despot, has to be attributed to the backdating of things that happened later. The fact is that to counter fragmentation, the situation required a stronger center that had existed before. And the change in terms of political and governmental policies was inevitable. Muawiyah also paid close attention to the financial administration of the government and made good use of the natural resources available. He made organizational reforms and improved the diwans and the postal service, al-barid, among many other things. And that enabled him a more central control or supervision of the provinces. Moreover, he paid a lot of attention to agriculture, especially in the Hijaz, and saw to it that uncultivated land was brought into cultivation. He carried out irrigation works, sank wells and built dams in Medina, Mecca and Taif. And we also find that later Umayyads were concerned with such projects because it was strategically important, since it also prevented revolts, either resulting or being intensified by a shortage of food. And the organization at the time of Muawiyah consisted of the Khalifa at the top, and under him there were Amirs and Ashraf, which were tribal leaders who provided a link between the government and the tribesmen. He did, however, not rely on old aristocracy, but looked for merit and loyalty in those governors he appointed. Many of his prominent governors were not even, in fact, Qurayshi, let alone Umayyad. During the reign of Muawiyah, there were few Khawarij uprisings against him, possibly due to the fact of his balanced rule and approach, which did not allow them to muster support locally. Muawiyah is also known for creating the first Muslim navy from the seafaring Syrians and Egyptians, which was a task that he had begun already as governor during the time of Uthman, and that enabled the Futuh to continue by sea. And he was, for example, the one who brought the Futuh to Sicily and Cyprus and so forth. The most important regions at the time of Muawiyah were the Hijaz, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, along with the eastern regions of Kufa, Basra, and Khorasan. The center of authority was located in Damascus, and the Khalifa was directly in command over Syria and Al Jazeera. The importance of Syria was not primarily due to its prosperity and great population, since other regions were both richer and more populous. Rather, Syria was the place where Muawiyah had been governor for almost 15 years, since the time of the Khilafah of Omar. And that had equipped him with loyal support from local authorities as well as the population. He had also been responsible for the development of its governmental organization and had for years built the Syrian army during the jihad against Byzantium. And the military power was in fact one of the most important sources of authority for the Umayyads. And we see later on in history that when they lost the authority over the military, that's when the Khilafah got weaker and weaker. Moreover, the ancient traditions of the Syrian lands, with its nearness to the ancient world civilizations, including the city of Jerusalem, for example, that have been mentioned by historians as reasons for the significance of Syria. Another important region was, of course, Iraq. And the historical importance of that province is well known. And at the time of Muawiyah, it was probably the richest and most prosperous region due to its beneficial climate and the agricultural opportunities along its river valleys. It also became a military center for the eastern expansion of Islam, with garrison towns such as Kufa and Al-Basra. The populations in these cities, however, consisted of a variety of peoples, tribes, races, religions, sects, and philosophical traditions, which made them melting pots of cultural exchange, but at the same time sources of opposition and sectarianism. Another important province during Muawiyah was Khorasan in the far northeast, and that region was both politically and geographically dependent on Iraq. And in fact, Khorasan and Kufa were the initial locations for the uprisings that later toppled Umayyad rule. The tensions which existed in Iraq and particularly in Kufa, were often carried over into Khorasan, where they tended to increase unchecked among both the settling Arabs and the non-Arab Mawali population. And this was because it was much more difficult for the Khulafa in Damascus to control the region of Khorasan due to the vast distances and the looser ties in comparison to, for example, North Africa or Arabia. And another one of these regions were Egypt and North Africa. And these were very important, for instance, military as the center of the Western expansion. It was important geopolitically because of its location at the heart of the Mediterranean, and economically with the fertile areas along the Nile that not only provided food for Egypt, but also for other regions, including Al-Hijaz. And in all these mentioned provinces, Muawiyah was very careful in choosing the local amirs who were responsible for matters such as jihad, leading the people in prayer, collecting taxes, supervising markets, appointing officers, and in general upholding order according to the law. And as for the collection of zakat, jizya, and kharaj, Muawiyah and the early Umayyads in general, in the same way as the Romans before them, relied on local elites to maintain social and economic order in the open regions, while providing a steady stream of tax income to the Bayt al-Mal. And thereby Muawiyah used the pre-existing bureaucracy to collect taxes and maintain the administrative documentation, although certain adjustments were made according to the legal regulations of the Sharia. And this practice of adopting pre-existing social and economic structures for the public benefit of the Muslims, which previously had characterized the reign of Omar and Uthman, that continued during Muawiyah. Towards the end of his life, Muawiyah decided to appoint his son Yazid as successor. And after 20 years of unity, new problems arose when Muawiyah died in year 60 after Hijrah. Muawiyah himself had foreseen that there would be problems, and he knew well where those problems lay, which was also the reason for his decision. Only 20 years had passed since the Fitnat al-Kubra, and Muawiyah's aim was to preserve order and avoid another fitna within the Ummah. That, he reasoned, required the Syrian army, as we previously have discussed, and the only person they would follow was Yazid. To avoid a scramble for power after his death, Muawiyah made people give bay'ah to Yazid while he was still alive. But of course, as we know, the scramble for power still occurred. But regardless of the reasons and justifications of the appointment, dynastic succession and its royal strategies indicated that the Muslims now completely had taken over as the main power in the region after the former Byzantine and Persian empires. The principle of the Khalifa being succeeded by his son or appointing a successor among his own people would then consistently be practiced by the Umayyads in the west and in the east, as well as by the later dynasty of Banu Abbas. But while the succession outwardly manifested the authority of the Muslims over the former world powers of Byzantium and Persia, it also marked the beginning of serious internal problems that would lead up to the second fitna. And then we come to the Khilafah of Yazid ibn Muawiyah, which lasted from year 60 to year 63 after Hijrah. When Yazid took over the leadership, the tensions that Muawiyah had managed to control were released. And this time, the trouble would not only arise from the eastern regions around Iraq, but also from the very heart of the community in the Hijaz. The relations between Yazid and some, or even many of the prominent Sahaba, including Al-Hussein ibn Ali and Abdullah ibn Az-Zubayr, they also worsened rapidly. Although Yazid initially was given bay'ah by the majority of the Muslims, his leadership was rejected by a small but very influential group of the Muslims, represented by Al-Hussein and Abdullah ibn Az-Zubayr in Al-Hijaz. And part of this was also based on the Medinan disapproval of the lifestyle in Syria, which seemed to them decadent and increasingly remote from the Sunnah of the previous Khulafa. First, Al-Hussein was encouraged by others to revolt. Steadier heads like Abdullah ibn Omar advised him not to do so. But most of those who encouraged him did not accompany him, and those who had invited him to revolt in Kufa, in fact, deserted him. And this was to become a pattern in later Shia uprisings. The Kufans would invite a candidate to revolt, promise support, and then disappear when the time came to fight. And although the resulting tragedy had important ramifications, it was politically completely ineffective. His support evaporated and his party was massacred at Karbala in year 61 after Hijrah. Around the same time, Abdullah ibn Az-Zubayr began to set up a counter-khilafah in Mecca. He did, however, not formally proclaim himself Khalifa until Yazid had died, instead staying in Mecca and denouncing him. And here we have the tension developing between conflicting views of the nature of the Khilafah. And very generally, the Umayyads emphasized that the Khalifa was the Sultan of political power, and the opposing view emphasized that he was an Imam and had a spiritual role as well. And the level of that spiritual authority thereby became a source of intense disagreement. The main opposition to Yazid came from the Medinans who revolted, and the fact that this was actually a revolt against the recognized authority is clear from one account we find in Sahih al-Bukhari, where Nafi said, when the people of Medina deposed Yazid ibn Muawiyah, Ibn Omar gathered his retinue and children and said, I heard the Prophet, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, say, a banner will be set up for every traitor on the day of rising. And he continued, we gave allegiance to this man in accordance with the allegiance to Allah and His Messenger. I know of no treachery worse than giving allegiance to a man in accordance with the allegiance to Allah and His Messenger, and then undertaking to fight him. If I learn that any of you have deposed him or pursued this matter, it will be a separation between me and him. The Medinans expelled the governor, they gave allegiance to one of themselves, and laid siege to the Umayyads in Medina, including the later Khalifa Marwan ibn al-Hakam. Some reports say that they also attacked the Mawali of Quraysh, and the reasons seem to have been based on rumors that then became accepted as a fact. At the same time, Abdullah ibn Az-Zubayr further mobilized his forces in Mecca, and his sphere of authority now included many regions of Iraq and southern Arabia, as well as parts of Syria and Egypt. And because of the different revolts against the Umayyads, which also included opposition from the Khawarij, who had come back, Yazid sent an army to quell the uprising, in which he sacked to quell the uprising in Hijaz. This led to the Battle of Al-Harra in the summer of 63 after Hijrah. And in this battle, Medina was sacked and a vast number of Ansar were killed. And Medina thereafter lost most of its political centrality and was never the same again. The Umayyad general, Muslim ibn Uqba, was ill and died soon after the attack on Medina. And his successor continued on with his army in order to deal with Ibn Zubayr, and at this time he laid siege to Mecca. Then, after 3 years of rule, Yazid died suddenly and the Syrian army withdrew. And then we come to the very short Khilafah of Muawiyah ibn Yazid, who was the son of Yazid, and that lasted for around, some people say 40 days, some say 2 months, some say 3 months, but it was around year 63 or 64 after Hijrah. The death of Yazid opened up for the culmination of the second fitna, since his son and successor, Muawiyah ibn Yazid, lacked the necessary experience of leadership and never enjoyed enough authority within the Ummah. His personal integrity might also have led to his decision to avoid the political turmoil and hand over the leadership to others. Soon after his succession, the 21-year-old Muawiyah, who also suffered from ill health, abdicated and died shortly after. As the historians relate, he never stood before his people, nor did he lead them in prayer, since his Khalifa only lasted for 40 days, although some people say 2 or even 3 months. And Muawiyah ibn Yazid was the last of the Khulafa from the lineage of Abu Sufyan. And during the power struggle after Yazid's death, the Umayyads were gradually pushed back towards the northern parts of Arabia, and they even lost much of their authority over Syria. Not until the final years of the actual collapse of the Umayyad rule was the authority in Syria threatened in the same way as after the death of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And the deaths of Yazid and his son created a leadership vacuum, and the Umayyads began to look elsewhere for potential successors. After some confusion, Marwan ibn al-Hakam, from the Abu al-As branch of Banu Umayya, became the representative of the Umayyads in year 64 after Hijrah. And this was a pure power struggle, and no one had any real justifications as to why they should be the ruler, but Marwan appears to have been given precedence due to his governmental experience and his very strong support. And this dynastic line of Banu Marwan was then to last until the fall of Umayyad rule, and was thereafter reinstated in Al-Andalus by Abdurrahman al-Dakhil and his descendants, which we will look at in one of the later lectures. At the time of Marwan, the Muslim community was divided into 2 camps, where both Marwan in Damascus and Ibn Zubayr in Mecca proclaimed themselves Amir al-Mu'mineen and were recognized as Khalifas. So in fact, as you have seen on the handouts, I have included Abdullah ibn Zubayr as one of the Khalifas. The political turmoil of the second fitna did, however, involve more groups than these 2. In particular, the Khawarij were once again active, and an extreme proto-Shia, Al-Mukhtar ibn Abi Ubaid, set up a movement in Iraq in support of Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya, another son of Ali ibn Abi Talib, but Muhammad in fact never wanted to have anything to do with it. Al-Mukhtar had initially offered his support to Ibn Zubayr, but when Ibn Zubayr refused to appoint him as governor, he rebelled against him in Kufa. And this rebellion of Al-Mukhtar is the first time that the Mawali plays a prominent role in such uprisings. Al-Mukhtar also proclaimed that Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya was the Mahdi, and after his death, the Shia idea of leader temporarily going into occultation was introduced. And as for the Khawarij revolt, it was this time somewhat a return to the Ridda wars, because it was the tribe of Banu Hanifa who were the source of leadership of the movement. Banu Hanifa had never offered allegiance to the Umayyads, properly speaking, and they wanted their independence from any Syrian authority. And when Ibn Zubayr rejected their terms, they turned on him as well. The Banu Hanifa then allied itself with the Khawarij. So it was not a proper Khawarij revolt, but joint interests which served each side. Otherwise, the Khawarij themselves would never have been so powerful as they were at this point in history. And various strategies were adopted by both the Zubayrids and the Umayyads to stop the Khawarij. And we have, for instance, the Umayyad leader Al-Muhallab ibn Abi Sufra made a deal that those who helped against the Khawarij would have 3 years of revenue for every province they recovered from for Al-Basra, where he was governor. In the midst of all these uprisings, which particularly weakened the side of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, the Syrian army was reinforced under the command of Marwan ibn al-Hakam. By a victory in a battle at Marj Rahit, east of Damascus, in year 64 after Hijrah, the Syrian authority was re-established in some of the most crucial regions. The Umayyads then took back Egypt and began limiting the authority of Zubayr to Al-Hijaz and Iraq, where Abdullah ibn Zubayr's brother Musab was the governor, and he was still struggling with various Khawarij and proto-Shia movements. At this point, however, Marwan, who was an elderly man, died and was succeeded by his son Abdul Malik. The disagreements were such that in year 68 after Hijrah, during the Hajj, there were 4 distinct groups, each camped apart from one another and representing or claiming to represent either Ibn Zubayr, Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya, the Khawarij leader Najda, or Abdul Malik of Banu Umayya. When Al-Mukhtar was killed, who was the supporter of Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya, the fight continued only between the Umayyads and Ibn Zubayr. The Khawarij, at least in respect of their main force, were rather looking for local autonomy rather than total political power. And then we're going to begin with some words on the Khilafah of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, although we will continue more in detail next time. And his reign lasted from year 65 to year 86 after Hijrah. And it was during the time of Abdul Malik that the second fitna culminated once and for all. While Abdul Malik increased his authority, Abdullah ibn Zubayr gradually lost more and more of his support in Iraq, where both the Khawarij and the proto-Shia movements had turned against him. In fact, Abdul Malik himself led the Syrian army in a battle against one of his closest childhood friends, which was Musab ibn Zubayr, the brother of Abdullah, and in year 72 after Hijrah, the Umayyad army defeated the Zubayrid forces of Iraq at the Battle of Deir al-Yathliq. Then Abdul Malik sent al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf with an army to invade Mecca. For 6.5 months, the army of al-Hajjaj besieged Mecca and bombarded the city from catapults and other siege engines until Ibn Zubayr was eventually killed in year 73 after Hijrah. And after the defeat of Ibn Zubayr, Abdul Malik consolidated Umayyad authority and stability was restored within the Ummah. And this year also became known as Am al-Jama'ah, the year of community, similarly to the beginning of the Khilafah of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. And thereby, we end this lecture in the same way as it began, with the political unification of the Muslim community under a strong central authority. And in the following lecture, we will further examine in detail the important Khilafah of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan and the Khulafa succeeding him, which includes 4 of his sons. It includes the Khilafah of Omar ibn Abdul Aziz and many others, until the collapse of Umayyad rule at the time of the last Khalifa, Marwan ibn Muhammad, who was the grandson of Marwan ibn al-Hakam. And for further reading relating to this lecture, I recommend Haji Aisha Bulis Muawiyah, Restorer of Muslim Faith. I recommend the relevant passages from Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi's Al-Awasim min al-Qawasim, which in English is translated as Defense Against Disaster, and also parts of Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. For example, the parts or the chapters that deals with questions such as Bay'ah, Khilafah, dynastic succession, Mulk, various institutions of the Dawla, transformation of Khilafah to Mulk, which is kingdom, and so forth. Because in many instances, Ibn Khaldun uses the history of Banu Umayya in particular to exemplify his historical theories. So when he talks about Bay'ah, when he talks about Khilafah or transformation from Khilafah to Mulk, he often uses the examples from the Umayyad history. So to at least have a look at those chapters would be very beneficial as a preparation for the next class, as well as for going into more details and getting a more historiographical and theoretical perspective on this history. And as for the recommended preparatory reading for the upcoming lecture, it is in apart from what I said about Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, it's also Jalaluddin Asyuti's Tarikh al-Khulafa, which in English is translated as History of the Caliphs. And then you look at the Umayyad Khulafa from Abdul Malik to Marwan ibn Muhammad. And so we will continue with the Khilafah of Abdul Malik next time, and we will also discuss the decline of the Umayyad Caliphate. So another book that I would like to recommend is Khalid Yahya Blankenship's The End of the Jihad State, The Reign of Hisham ibn Abdul Malik and the Collapse of the Umayyads, which is an in-depth study of that subject. Thank you all for your attention. Assalamu alaikum. Okay, is there any questions?
I would like to know a little bit about
Yes.
the different groups you mentioned. There was ruled over by the
Oh yes. So the question is, I think the question is which various groups and races and religions and so on that existed during the time of the Umayyads.
Yeah.
And the thing I spoke about, mentioned in the talk, was the situation in Kufa, in particular. Yeah, because there you have old Persian traditions, both religious, like Zoroastrianism. You have the Christians and whatever groups were of those, and you have the various more kind of scholarly or philosophical traditions in a way. And that's also the regions where you have the most Khawarij movements. You have the Shias developing there, and yeah, it was really. And then of course you have people from various backgrounds, which might be even more important. So it was the nature of the old Persian Empire, which was not only Persian, so to speak. It was the Persian who led the empire, but there was a lot of people from various races and peoples and tribes and so on who came under their rule, and so it was a melting pot of cultural exchange. Any other? Yeah.
Added to that, how far had they reached in terms of dawah?
Okay, the question is how far had they reached in terms of dawah? You mean in the Persian and the Iraqi region?
Well, I'm going to assume that they'd actually gone a lot further than that, had they?
Yeah, they reached. Khorasan is northeast of Iraq, for example. So they reached, in terms of political authority, they had reached far beyond that. But you have to understand that it wasn't like the whole population became Muslim. In fact, when there's some modern research who have gone through the documentation in the diwans and so on from the registers in the Persian regions at the time, in the beginning of the Abbasid Caliphate, and those researchers have said that it was around 5, 6, 7% of the population in Persia were Muslim at the time of the beginning of the Abbasids. So if you say the rate of conversion is a process that takes very, very long time, and for example, it's the same in Egypt. You have the same situation in Syria, and in all regions that Islam have been established, apart from Arabia, where there you had the option of, you had to become a Muslim or fight. But in the other regions, many people lived as dhimmi population and paid the jizya and so on. So it took centuries before even the majority, even the half of the population, became Muslim. So yes.
This period is often seen as a time of the persecution of the Ahlul Bayt.
Yes.
How do you reconcile that perception?
The question is that the Umayyad times is often seen as a time of persecution against the Ahlul Bayt. And I quite deliberately avoiding going into too much of that subject, because in order to talk about those things, you need to devote so much time to it to really go into all the details. But one thing that we can say, that when we discuss the Umayyad history, is that the sources, if you say the Umayyad sources, them describing their own caliphate, they're lost. And much of the historical sources that we have come from a later point in history, where people wrote against the Umayyads, very, very generally now. But that is the situation. So for various political, religious, or other reasons, people describe the history of the Umayyads as very oppressive and so on. And in fact, it's difficult for us to say, was that the case or was it not the case, because we don't have enough source material about the period. But it is true. For example, we have the Karbala event, for example, and it's those events which are, of course, a great tragedy, but they also become they get given a very much a symbolical importance for all these later movements. So I recommend the book Ala Wasim min al-Qawasim, Qari Abu Bakr's book, Defense Against Disaster, which he goes into detail about all those questions that always comes up when you discuss the Khilafah of Banu Umayya.
Is that book available?
Yes, it's definitely available, and I think you should publish it through the D1 Press. So,
Preparing a second edition.
it's being revised, and the second edition is on its way. But the old one is also available. I think it might be difficult to get nowadays, but yeah. But yes. Is there any other questions? Yeah.
At one point you mentioned they had a postal service.
Yes.
Would you give us a kind of picture of how their structure?
To be honest, I have not. Yeah, the question is that the Umayyads, really, I think from the time of Muawiyah and onwards, established a postal service. So I have not personally gone in to study exactly the details of how it all worked out, but the importance of that in the political history we're talking about now is that it enabled the Khalifa to have more direct contact with all the various amirs, all the local officials, and in faraway regions. And that was something that Muawiyah really put an effort in to develop and to make more efficient. But as I said, the exact structures of it is not something that I have studied in depth.
Just quickly, the time that the Khalifa was in Damascus, what is that period? You may have mentioned it and I missed it.
In fact, the question is during which time the Khalifa was in Damascus, and it's all the Umayyad caliphs, Khalifas were in Damascus, apart from some of the later ones moved outside and placed their place of residence outside, or even moved it to towns a bit outside of Damascus. So in the end, because of the internal problems and so on, they had to move it from Damascus in order to defend themselves or so on. But otherwise, it was during the whole Umayyad times. It was in Damascus. Any other questions?